Sit down. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon we have, as part of our informational program, Major General Robert R. Williams of the United States Army. General Williams is the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Force Development on the Army staff. He's a very qualified person in Army aviation. He's a 1940 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. He was the first chief of the Flight Division when the Department of Air Training was formed in the Field Artillery School in 1942. He was the first ground officer to receive an instrument rating. He organized and was the first president of the Army Aviation Board. He was the first Army aviator to be designated a Master Army Aviator and is a qualified Navy jet pilot. He has held several Army aviation assignments, including command of the 1st Aviation Brigade in Vietnam. We have full biographies on General Williams if you would desire them. General?
Thank you very much, Mr. Captain. Introduction like that always makes me feel so old. I'd like to talk to you about the helicopter operations in Vietnam, a subject which has received considerable attention lately. First, I'll deal with the question of vulnerability and survivability of the helicopter and the varying degrees of combat. And secondly, I'd like to discuss the contribution of the helicopter to accomplishing our mission in Vietnam. The Army's been operating helicopters in Vietnam now since December of 1961. They were initially employed against a very primitive enemy who was armed with obsolete rifles and few, if any, automatic weapons. In this environment, the helicopters were operated without the protection of the helicopter gunships, and other supporting fires were very limited. Since 1961, there's been a steady increase in the enemy's firepower. They now have automatic weapons, 50 caliber machine guns, and other anti-aircraft weapons. However, as the enemy's threat against our aircraft has increased, so has our capability to counter this threat. We've mounted machine guns on both sides of the troop-carrying helicopters. They're escorted by Cobras, firing rockets and other improved munitions. We've improved our tactics. Helicopter formations avoid overflying concentrations of enemy troops. Routes to and from the objectives are carefully selected, and supporting fires are habitually used in the preparation of the landing zones. During 1962, the loss rate for helicopters in Vietnam was 1 to every 5,290 sorties. As a result of our improved weaponry, tactics, and techniques, in calendar year 1968, we lost only one helicopter in 12,716 sorties. To illustrate this in another way, the loss of one helicopter in Vietnam in 1962 would hardly make news. However, it would have represented 1% of our inventory. Based on that rate and on our current aircraft inventory, we would have to lose in a single day 34 helicopters to be comparable to one in 1962. Such a loss obviously would receive much publicity. The loss rate I have quoted was established over an extended period of time. It must be recognized that these rates are not consistent on a day-to-day basis. Aircraft losses, like armored vehicle losses, casualty rates, and enemy kill rates, vary greatly with the intensity of combat, and they follow quite parallel curves. I can remember no time when we experienced high aircraft loss rates that we were not at the same time inflicting even higher kill rates on the enemy. Many people are of the erroneous impression that the helicopter, by the very nature of its construction, is a fragile piece of machinery. Actually, it's a pretty tough bird. Not only can it take considerable punishment and come home with many wounds, but it also has one major advantage over fixed-wing aircraft. When it is shot down, or when it goes down with mechanical difficulties, its inherent flight characteristics are such that it can usually achieve a survivable landing for the aircraft and the crew. For example, the first OH-6 Cayuse helicopter in Vietnam to complete 1,000 hours of combat flying had, at the end of the 1,000 hours, been shot down 5 times and recovered. It had received fire on 57 occasions, and it had survived over 150 bullet strikes. It was finally retrograded to the States for overhaul and is probably back in Vietnam flying again. There's no question that our loss of helicopters in Vietnam does represent a substantial amount of money. However, to put this in perspective, I believe we must ask, what is the alternative to gain the same end? The experience of the French in Southeast Asia and the British in Malaysia convinced military authorities that for a conventional force to track down and cope with a guerrilla force required a force ratio of at least 10 to 1. We've been successful in Vietnam with a force ratio of approximately 6 to 1. We've been able to cope with the guerrillas and even the organized enemy units by employing helicopters to make our forces highly mobile and to free ourselves when necessary from the tenuous lines of communication. These lines are very vulnerable to enemy interdiction. As General Westmoreland stated in a speech on the 1st of November 1968, and I quote, "How many troops would have been needed without the helicopter? If we accept the 10 to 1 ratio, we would need nearly 2.5 million troops to counter the combined strength of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese